The criminal law is really the foundation to some degree of why we're worried about expansive government and why we support limited government. The ability to take away someone's life or liberty and put them in prison is sort of the core issue that we're worried about, even more so than tax and regulation and these other sorts of things. The second thing is, if we're going to do that, then people really need to be on notice for what's criminal. We don't want to be locking people up for making innocent mistakes. And it's sort of an old maxim in the American law and the Anglo-American law that that ignorance of the law is no excuse. But that was before we had 300,000 federal crimes, and I don't know how many state crimes there are in North Carolina. We couldn't really quite figure it out, but there's so many, and they go beyond the criminal code. They go beyond the statutory code itself into all sorts of other areas of law, that if we really want people to be able to comply with the law, we ought to make it easier to understand what that law is, and really try not to punish the innocent people who are trying to run a family farm or a small business, but inadvertently making a mistake based on the volume of law that's out there. The good answer for North Carolina is all the states are equally bad in this to some degree. Every state has many multiples of crimes in their state criminal code that goes beyond the model penal code. Every state has hundreds of thousands of pages of crimes. Every state has some form of delegation of crime creation to regulatory agencies or municipalities or private bodies at some level. North Carolina is an outlier in terms of creating more felonies. North Carolina's just been creating a higher percentage of felonies. So that's a problem given the collateral consequences for being a felon. You lose the right to vote, you lose the right to bear arms, it's much harder to get a job. So that's something that we found particularly worrisome in North Carolina. But all the states have problems along these areas. Well, I think it's a really big problem. I mean, if you look at the totality of the statute books, because the majority of crimes, 2/3 of the crimes in North Carolina, most places, are not in the criminal code itself. The criminal code itself is much bigger than it needs to be. There's a lot of crimes out in the statute books beyond that. And then you'd have to go through each municipality's ordinance, depending on where you are, to decide what's a crime. You'd have to look through the regulatory codes in public health and environment and agriculture. You'd have to look through the sort of standards set by the guilds in areas like nutrition or dentistry or what have you to know that you're not violating these crimes. So innocent people are getting wrapped up in the law. And sometimes they're being good neighbors. Sometimes they're just running a business, but they don't know what size box they're supposed to use or what form they're supposed to fill out. Now, I do think, let's be fair, I do think most prosecutors are trying to do a good job. Generally, they're not trying to just ensnare people who are unknowingly committing these sorts of violations. But we have seen North Carolina litigate this up to the U.S. Supreme Court when it came to private businesses trying to set up teeth whitening kiosks that created a conflict for the dentists. I mean, the dentists obviously don't want competition. This is very profitable for them. The question is this a real public health concern or not? And the state legislature is not even weighing in on it. All they're doing is saying, well, whatever standards the dentists come up with on their own are the standards, and if you violate it, you're committing a crime. So these are real problems. We've had individuals in North Carolina who set up a blog, diabetics, said, this is what I did to try to fix my own diet. Get in trouble with the state over this because they weren't complying with the nutritionists' rules, et cetera. They were trying to practice dietetics without a license or whatever the rule is. So these are real issues that can ensnare real people. It's not easy to fix, unfortunately. You could put in prophylactics. In other words, you can say we're going to let people fight back if they make an innocent mistake, or we're going to require various criminal intent. But without even knowing what all the rules are, what all the crimes are, we don't know what all the unintended consequences would be of doing that. So what North Carolina's done, a little different from some of the other states, and I think it's to their credit, but they're just getting the ball rolling on it, is to try to say we need to figure out what we've got. We need to look at all these crimes. We need to recodify this. We need to try to understand the problem first and simplify it. But given how vast the criminal code is, but the overall statute books are, and all these sort of subsidiary regulations and ordinances that have criminal teeth are. It's a big effort and a big lift. And I'm hoping North Carolina can stick with it. It would really be a model for the nation if North Carolina can get this done. I think it would show that it can be done. I mean, part of the reason why this hasn't happened is everyone just says it's just impossible. Now, other states have done various things. Some states, we've worked with Ohio and Michigan, and they set up default criminal intent standards to try to protect the innocent folks who were getting ensnared by some of the rules. And that seems to have worked reasonably well. Other states, Kansas has an office of the repealer, trying to repeal old crimes. Minnesota had an unsession trying to take crimes off the books. And so those things can work to some degree, but you're maybe just getting low-hanging fruit when you do that, and you're not necessarily recodifying everything and simplifying it and streamlining it. It's very difficult to do. It's not the sort of thing the average legislator is going to go home with and say, vote for me, we did this, because nobody's really getting an immediate benefit from it, but it's really important. And so if North Carolina does it and shows it can be done, other states I think will follow. It's one of these things that cuts across, I think, both party labels and ideologies. There are areas of the criminal law that are going to be more controversial. What do we do about narcotics and drugs? What are we going to do in terms of bail and incarceration and imprisoning people when they're violent criminals, the murderers, the rapists, the assaulters? I mean, people don't want those folks running out on the street, but there's disagreement. There's disagreement between conservatives and libertarians on these sorts of things. But this is really different. This is about fundamental notice and who's getting hurt the most by these sorts of regulatory crimes, particularly at the state level. It's the small business owner. It's the sole proprietor. It's the family farmer. This isn't about saving white-collar criminals who work at giant corporations, because those giant corporations have compliance teams. They sometimes break the law, but it's hard to argue that they're not knowing when they're doing it. They may be trying to skirt the law and skirt the legal rules, but by and large, they're reviewing it with their in-house lawyers or their outside counsel. The average sort of person out there doesn't have that. And so these sorts of small business owners that are doing this, these family farmers, I mean, these are disproportionately people who have less education, disproportionately are going to be minorities or women or people who aren't working at big businesses and things like that. That's who's often getting ensnared by these rules. So I'm hopeful that this is the sort of thing where you might actually see the atypical bipartisan compromise. Well, I think there's interest, and the good folks at the John Locke Foundation have connected me with people in the legislature, various stakeholders, and I've talked to them, and Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives can kind of agree on the basic principles here. The hard thing is to get the hard work done, and to get people to actually look at it and spend the time. And that's what's really going to be the heavy lift. But I think there are people committed to it. I think there are people who understand the problem. And if we can frame the problem correctly, a small number of people who really care about something like this can get a lot done. There just has to be the will to get it done. We're active in a group, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is one of various groups that bring together folks in the private sector as well as legislators and draft model bills. And they've adopted model bills in all the 5 areas that parallel what we've called for in our report looking at these problems across various states. And I continue to point out to them, look at what North Carolina is doing. North Carolina is actually taking up some of this hard work, because to get to the notion of repealing things, recodifying things, cleaning things up, I mean, this is the harder lift, and a lot of legislators are averse to doing it. And if North Carolina can do it well, I think we'll get some significant momentum in other states. The hope here is that it'd be much more streamlined. The hope is that if you're out there starting a business or doing something and you're not sure, you'd be able to actually find the answer, not just doing a Google search and randomly trying to play lawyer by Google. I mean, the reality is it's hard for people with legal training, myself included, to actually figure out whether something is criminal or not in North Carolina. I mean, I just got through putting a pool in at my house to try to get those codes. I mean, I was eventually able to find it, but the average person is not going to be able to do that. So I think if North Carolina does this right, it'll be easier for folks to figure out what's legal and what's not. That should increase compliance with the law. And it will give legislators a bit more understanding of what's out there too, so that the next time a constituent comes to them with a problem, and these legislators are generally reacting to constituents coming to them with the problems, they're trying to do the right thing. They say, oh, there's a problem, let's put a law on the books about it. They'll be able to slot it in there in a more logical way. The broader hope and the bigger hope for North Carolina is that by cleaning this up, you'll actually encourage more entrepreneurship, more small business owners, more family farmers, create more competitive markets. I mean, North Carolina has been doing gangbusters to some degree in the last several years in terms of job growth, attracting new people here, et cetera. But to keep that ball going, to keep that ball rolling, to keep that positive momentum moving forward, requires continuing to think about areas that may be inhibiting some of that growth. And so my hope is, in the long run, it'd be a job and economic growth creation strategy, as well as a strategy for protecting the innocent individuals and small businesses out there.